Dr. Fofak, thank you for your time. I mean, when you look through this report, you can see clearly a lot of work has been put into this. So I wanted to give you the opportunity of breaking down the main parts of it. But I wanted us to devote a larger part of the discussion to the risks, which you characterize as both familiar and novel.
Yes, thank you very much. I think Godfrey has been a great ambassador of economic prospect. So I am very pleased to have this discussion with you. And I think your colleague is right in terms of forecast. And if you look at 2020, pre-pandemic, I mean, the IMF forecast synchronized global growth accelerations. And then we had a black swan event. I think what happened last year was quite unusual in the sense that it's once in a lifetime event, which can actually distort all forecasts that were actually planned. But as far as Africa is concerned, I think the continent has always been very resilient. And we also saw that in 2020, in middle pandemic, whereby as the global economy was contracting by 3.5%, Africa contracted but less. Even though we went through our first recession in 25 years, we still had within the continent a number of countries which actually achieved economic expansions. And if you look at IMF estimates for 2020, 6 of the top 10 fastest growing economies in the world were in Africa, which was a bit consistent with what we've seen over the last decade. I think that's where we're coming from. And if we then look at the global picture, and with China expanding at more than 8%, India more than 11%, and the EU more than 4.5%, then you can see why forecasts for Africa will be anywhere between the EU and China, in the sense that these countries or blocks together account for more than 50% of total African trade. So as we see that strong recovery in China, there will be spillover effect and strengthening economic recovery within the African continent. And that's one main reason behind those robust forecasts that we indicated. But there are other reasons besides the strong recovery in China, which will affect Africa through trade and investment. Another important aspect of that recovery lies in the nature of the crisis. If you compare 2020 with the 2008-2009 financial crisis, I think this one is a crisis of demand and supply shocks. In other words, the large fiscal stimulus and monetary injections that we have from central banks and finance ministries are not going to what I call black box, but they are going into the real economy, and which will tend to have more positive spillover effect for the rest of the world than what we saw during the financial crisis, where essentially those injections went into black box, which are essentially the balance sheet of banks, but not really captured into the real economies. And so that's another main reason. But the third one, which is very important, is that for many years within the African continent, we've essentially gone for what I call financial repressions, where central banks and monetary authority went for a single objective, price stability, and neglected growth. In this crisis, something unique happened, where more than 35 African countries actually lower interest rates to support the recovery and growth. So that was significant. And if you add to that, of course, the support provided by multilateral agencies, the IMF, the FDB, and the World and the Afreximbank through its PATIMFA, you can see why the recovery will be so quick, because after all, the crisis was one that was engineered in terms of imposing lockdown and containment measures.
Yeah, Africa, of course, Doctor, is a land of many parts, 53, 54 territories, depending on your political inclination. And when we talk about that recovery, it will be uneven. So I wanted to focus a little bit of our conversation on those countries that are most at risk. And we know you mentioned 35 African countries are using monetary policy to try to cushion their economies from the impact of COVID-19. But we also know that At the same time, many of our Africa's economies don't have appropriate transmission mechanisms for the full impact of those lower interest rates to be felt. Who is likely to be benefiting from that action that we're seeing taken by these central banks, and who is unlikely to benefit? Is there a common theme that we can identify in those?
In fact, monetary authorities did not just use interest rate. They also used a whole set of measures, including macroprudentials, looking at the capital requirement, looking at moratorium to actually give more room to corporations, which were actually not forced to essentially honor their commitment within the time frame. So those moratorium, those measures undertaken by central bank to give more flexibility to corporate, which were first balance sheet crisis, actually also help a lot in making sure that what I call avoidable bankruptcy are actually avoided. So actually a combination of several measures. Of course, if you look at interest rate arrangement, which were undertaken by these countries, the whole range from about 400 basis points in Egypt to less about 1 basis point at the lower end of it. So we have countries which had more degrees of freedom at lower interest rate than others. And that is the dynamic we see across the continent. But we have a combination of both monetary, across a wide spectrum, moratoriums, but also capital, macroprudential interest rate, but also fiscal response undertaken by several of these countries. But you're right, even in the midst of those measures and the recovery that we actually put forward with a strong rebound in 2021 is not going to be uniform. We'll have a number of countries which are likely to be lagging behind, in particular, the tourism-dependent economies, for the simple reason that the stickiness of self-imposed risk aversion behavior is such that it will be difficult for consumer-facing industries, tourism, hotels, and so forth, and service industry to recover at the speed that we expect from other industry, especially in the realm of manufacturing and so forth. So there will be some variations across the continent, with countries in the small islands, in Seychelles and Mauritius, but also Cape Verde, and heavily dependent on tourism, will actually be achieving recovery more gradually than what we'll expect from other countries.
Right. Dr. Fofak, it's Fifi here. I hope you're not too disappointed to be speaking with me, but nonetheless, no, just you know, such warmth shown to my colleague. But I'll forgive you; it is the first time that you are speaking with me. So, I would like to probe you on your forecast for growth. And while you do make a very compelling case as to how the continent will be uplifted from the recession-induced COVID-19 pandemic, mainly as a result of our major trading partners, India and China, showing growth that shoots the lights out. How sensitive is your forecast to the pace of the vaccine rollout on the continent? Because we have seen hiccups happening elsewhere, which has kind of put a puncture to the pace of recovery that we're all hoping for. So just talk to me about the role that the vaccination rollout program has in ensuring that we do reach the growth milestones that you are guiding for, sir.
I think that's a fair point. It's an excellent question, actually. And the forecast that we put forward, we specifically stress that the pace of the recovery will very much depend on the dynamic of the vaccine at this stage. And the dynamic, how fast the world is at controlling the spread of the COVID-19 virus. I think that's a key assumption under all the forecasts that we've put forward within this exercise. And the vaccine is what will unlock Africa and global economies and put them on the path of a synchronized global recovery. And it's also quite clear that what we've seen so far in terms of vaccine holding, in terms of banning export, it's not amenable to that synchronized global recovery. But it's also important to point out that there is now ongoing effort to make sure that the key constraints we have on vaccination, which are essentially on the supply side, are lifted to provide room for vaccine manufacturing across the world, including in South Africa, in India, and other African countries, to increase the productions and reduce the constraint in accessing vaccine. I think that's what we are pushing at Afreximbank, but also I see that within the African Union to have it as a common approach. But that's one aspect of it in terms of manufacturing. Another aspect that we are pursuing within Afreximbank to make sure that we have access to it, it's what we call advanced procurement program, which essentially to say that let's approach these vaccine manufacturing corporations and see how we could actually provide some guarantee, exactly what countries such as Singapore have done in terms of increasing access. But we are also in parallel approaching countries which have actually secured those which are a multiple of their populations. I can refer to Canada as one of them, so they can release some of those doses for African countries which are also in need. So it's quite clear that it is quite clear to us that yes, making progress on vaccine, accessing the vaccine, but also having the logistic infrastructure for effective rollout will be critical to sustain the growth forecast that we put forward this year.
Absolutely, a lot of work going in the background to try to make sure that Africa is not left behind again. Dr. Hippolyte Fofak, thank you for joining us this afternoon.